It's a common trope in media to depict commanders giving rousing speeches to their troops before battle. Such scenes look and sound awesome in the moment, but once the emotions have died down and you start to consider the practicality of such displays, some troubling questions arise. Hang on, can anyone hear them in the back? Can the people next to him even hear him through their helmets? Won't the wind or other battlefield noises drown him out? What if the enemy attacks right now? In this video, we'll seek to answer the question of whether these general speeches really happened. You can lead your own soldiers into battle through our sponsor, Call of War. Call of War is a free online PvP strategy game played by millions of users worldwide. Choose your country, join the war, and fight other players in epic real-time battles across a campaign that will see you conquer the world over the course of weeks. You start in historical World War II conditions, but are free to take the reins of command to rewrite history as you see fit. Use the strengths and weaknesses of different iconic World War II unit types such as tanks, planes, and ships. Choose your own strategy to dominate your enemies. Tank rush your opponents, establish air superiority, or bombard coastal cities. You can also invest in the research tree to use atomic bombs and other superweapons from World War II. Build an empire by conquering provinces, capturing capitals, and taking over entire countries. Establish strategic alliances with other players, and win by waging total war on your neighbors. Call of War is now available across platforms, so you can play with the same account on PC and mobile. Click the link in the description below to get a 30-day limited time offer of 13,000 gold and 1 month of high command subscription for free. See you on the battlefield. Okay, so right off the bat, I want to say that general speeches do appear in the historical record. But don't take this upfront answer as being too anticlimactic. We have a lot to discuss when it comes to the specifics. This includes, what did they say, why did they say it, and how did they say it? The first detail to cover is what did they say? Well, often, we just get brief mentions of a general addressing the troops, or perhaps a quick summary. Here's an example from the Battle of Salamis. Quote, "At daybreak, they held an assembly of the fighting men, and Themistocles alone of them all foretold victory. He spent the whole of his speech contrasting all the better and the worse aspects of human nature and condition, and encouraging the men to choose the better course. He ended by sending them off to their ships." Here's another example from the historian Frontius. Quote, "When Epaminondas, commander of the Thebans, was about to fight against the Spartans, to make his soldiers not only physically, but also emotionally stronger, he announced in a speech that the Spartans had resolved, if victorious, to kill all males, lead their wives and children away into slavery, and destroy Thebes utterly. The Thebans were stirred up by this announcement and broke through the Spartans on the first attack." It turns out that these sorts of descriptions actually seem to accompany most military narratives, from famous Greek authors like Herodotus, Xenophon, and particularly Thucydides. In fact, their writings often go so far as to give us entire quotes. At the Battle of Plataea, Herodotus writes that a general of the Phocians exhorted his men as follows, quote, "Men of Phocis, seeing that death at these fellows' hands is staring us in the face, it is now time for every one of you to be noble, for it is better to end our lives in action and fighting than tamely to suffer a shameful death. No, rather, we will teach those barbarians that the ones they mean to kill are men of Hellas." Xenophon tells of the Spartan commander Archidamos encouraging his forces during an invasion of Attica in 368 BC, following some of their own recent defeats. Quote, "Citizens, let us be brave men, and thus be able to look people in the face. Let us hand onto those who come after us the fatherland as we received it from our fathers. Let us cease to feel shame before women and children and elders and foreigners, who once thought us the best of all the Greeks." His words did not fall on deaf ears, as the Spartans apparently went on to wipe out their foes without a single loss in what became known as the Tearless Battle. In the Peloponnesian War, we were treated to many lengthy speeches by Thucydides. Here's a short section of our particular example given by the distinguished Spartan commander Tacitus during one of his Thracian campaigns. Quote, "Peloponnesians, if I did not suspect you of being dismayed at being abandoned by the Macedonians to sustain the attack of a numerous enemy, I should just have said a few words to you as usual without further explanation. As it is though, in the face of desertion of our friends and the numbers of the enemy, I have some advice and information to offer. The bravery that you so habitually display in war does not depend on you having allies at your side in this or that encounter, but on your native courage. Nor have numbers any terrors for citizens of states like yours, in which the many do not rule the few, but rather the few the many, owing their position to nothing else than to superiority in the field. I could go on and on with such excerpts from Thucydides and others. In fact, these sorts of speeches are not just restricted to Greek warfare alone. We have chroniclers with similar passages from all kinds of time periods and commanders. Arrian and Rufus report how Alexander the Great addressed his men before the Battle of Issus and Gaugamela. Livy and Polybius mention speeches made by Hannibal in the crossing of the Alps and before the battles of Cannae and Zama. Caesar tells of the way the Gauls addressed their forces. Appian writes of how Pompey and Caesar addressed the legions in the civil war at climactic battles like Pharsalus. And Tacitus captures the words of the German commander Arminius before the Battle of Idistaviso. Wow, the evidence really seems to be mounting here. But hang on, how did Livy know what Hannibal was saying in Phoenician? Or how did Caesar know what the Gauls were saying in Gallic? In fact, even the accuracy of speeches delivered in the author's native tongue should raise some suspicion, given just how painstakingly long-winded they can be. I'm looking at you, Thucydides, and the fact that they are often being recorded well after the events took place. Is any of this even real? Did they really say that? This is a very hard question to answer, and one which is the focus of much academic interest. The scholar Mogens Hansen, for instance, wrote an influential paper entitled The Battle Exhortation in Ancient Historiography, Fact or Fiction. It takes a fairly hard line on questioning the authenticity of these events and has stirred up much debate. In response, other scholars have focused on key passages to support the position that speeches were indeed a real fixture of the ancient battlefield. Examples include passages where generals actually forgo the use of speeches out of personal preference, a lack of time, or the presence of just too many troops, while we have other examples where speeches are actually cut short due to the assault of the enemy. Such inclusions in our records would be quite odd if these speeches were purely rhetorical devices inserted after the fact by authors. But even if we conclude that speeches did indeed occur, we are still left with the question about the accuracy of their contents. This subject is even one that gets commented on by our sources as well. Thucydides famously writes, quote, "As to the various speeches made on the eve of the war, or in its course, I have found it difficult to retain a memory of the precise words which I had heard spoken, and so it was with those who brought me reports. But I have made the persons say what it seemed to me most opportune for them to say, in view of each situation. At the same time, I have adhered as closely as possible to the general sense of what was actually said." In these matters, Thucydides really seems to have been a pioneer. His history of the Peloponnesian War is filled with many such speeches, which are deliberately used to build up the greater storylines of his narrative. Putting words into the mouths of characters proved to be a powerful rhetorical device, and in time, this sort of approach would become quite popular with other writers. The trend thus became a regular part of ancient historiography. Other writers throughout the ages further added to this cottage industry of embellished speeches. Shakespeare, for example, pushed this practice to the limit by using battle speeches as climactic scenes to be enjoyed by the general public. For instance, it is in his play that Henry V delivers the famous St. Crispin's Day speech on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, which ends as follows, quote, "This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world. But we, in it, shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day." Such was the emotional resonance of this passage that it would go on to echo throughout the ages of English history and be quoted by other real commanders in battle. Many people today still mistakenly attribute the speech to the historical Henry V. Looking at actual records, we do know from the Burgundian accounts that Henry did indeed give a speech. However, the few scraps of direct quotation we get do not include anything like the Band of Brothers line, and instead focus more on the validity of the cause in the eyes of God. Quote, "The Almighty, with these his humble few, is able to overcome the opposing arrogance of the French." Certainly uplifting, but nothing like the crowd-raising delivery of the play. It's also from Shakespeare that we get more marvelous but fictitious quotes, such as, "Once more unto the breach," and cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. The technique of embellishing speeches was fairly common knowledge at the time and was also known to future historians. For instance, Voltaire in the 18th century writes, quote, "Set speeches are a sort of oratorical lie, which the historian used to allow himself in old times. He used to make his heroes say what they might have said. At the present day, these fictions are no longer tolerated. If one put into the mouth of a prince a speech which he had never made, the historian would be regarded as a rhetorician." I'd say that Voltaire may have been a bit too bold with his claim that made-up speeches were a thing of the past. After all, speeches in his own era were just as prone to being distorted and mythologized. However, he is certainly onto something when he talks about accuracy generally getting better over time. Historical methods have improved, as well as the means of capturing speeches and preserving those documents. For instance, when Queen Elizabeth I delivered her speech to the English troops at Tilbury in anticipation of repulsing the Spanish Armada in 1588, there were several letters written of the event, which were soon after stored in libraries or published for further distribution. It's from these that we get the famous lines, quote, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." As time went on, and technology brought about things like the printing press, the radio, and television, speeches became more and more widely accessible. However, I should note that at the same time, the frequency of generals giving speeches to their armies diminished, owing to the changing nature of warfare. Okay, so far we've answered what did they say, by concluding that general speeches were indeed a historical reality, but did not necessarily take the form quoted to us by our sources. This still leaves two outstanding questions. Why did they say it, and how did they say it? The why part should be fairly straightforward to answer. Warfare by its very nature is an incredibly traumatic human experience for which one must be adequately prepared. It's not just a matter of strength, but also a matter of wills, with army morale being an incredibly important factor in achieving victory. The primary purpose of speeches was therefore to improve the morale of one's army. However, words alone could not necessarily carry the day. The Greek Onisander states in his work on the duties of a commander that, quote, "Whenever despondency and fear have infected an army because the enemy has received reinforcements or gained an advantage, then, above all, the general should show himself to the soldiers as genial, cheerful, and resolute. For the appearance of the commander brings a reciprocal change in the minds of the soldiers. And if the general is confident and looks cheerful, the army also takes courage in the belief that there is no danger. But if the general is downcast and anxious, then the soldiers' spirits drop in the belief that a great disaster is imminent. Therefore, the general must inspire the confidence of the army more by the expression on his face than by his words. For many people distrust speeches because they have been put together to suit the occasion, but thinking that a confident appearance is sincere, trust in his fearlessness. But it is good to understand both these ideas and to say the appropriate words and have the appropriate expression. Speeches might also be delivered to opposing armies. Herodotus, for example, tells of many Persian heralds riding over to the Greek side to chastise them or to try to convince them to lay down their arms. Likewise, the Greeks tried to use their own speeches to psychologically target the enemy. In one instance, an allied ship apparently sailed along the coast to yell messages at the Greeks marching along with the Persians so as to get them either to defect or at least get the Persians to doubt their loyalty. Before other battles, these verbal back and forths might be used to try and intimidate the enemy or elicit duels before the main fight even began. This was especially common in smaller scale fighting between tribal warbands. Okay, so the why did they say it question should now be answered. Let's finally turn to the question of how did they say it. What I mean by this is, let's assume I'm a general who wants to give a speech. How do I do so to an army that might number in the tens of thousands? My voice can't possibly carry that far, let alone be heard over the ambient noises generated by a large crowd of men and beasts in armor. In my own research, I actually found that scientists have attempted to quantify this problem. This fascinating article, for instance, recaps acoustic simulation of Julius Caesar's battlefield speeches. Here are their results. Quote, "Simulations show that for reasonable background noise, Caesar could have been heard intelligibly by 14,000 soldiers in a quiet, controlled environment, as in a speech at Dyrrhachium. In contrast, even granting generous acoustic and geometric conditions, Caesar could not have been heard by more than about 700 soldiers while his army was on the march before the Battle of Pharsalus." While their findings are not the end-all, be-all for this discussion, it does show that in most cases, the generals in our speeches quoted earlier would likely not have been audible to their whole army. Therefore, we must wonder what they did to effectively communicate. The following options have been proposed. 1. The general delivered their speech just once to a small portion of the army. 2. The general delivered their speech multiple times to cover a larger portion of the army. And 3. The general delivered the speech once, but was assisted in the process. Subjectively speaking, this last one seems the most likely to me. While we don't know exactly how this would have worked, the process likely involved the commander breaking up their speech into small sections. When they paused, the lines would be repeated by officers throughout the crowd. Then the next passage was delivered, and the whole cascading process repeated until its conclusion. You can actually see this a lot in modern public gatherings, and it's quite effective. Anyways, I hope you found this whole discussion as fascinating as I have. I'll leave a bunch of links below to sources so you can dive deeper into the subject. Let me know if you've got any more questions I can address in a follow-up video. A huge thanks to the patrons who funded this episode and who keep our channel running. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out the rest of our history documentaries. Thanks for watching. Call of War is a free online PvP strategy game played by millions of users worldwide. Choose your country, join the war, and fight other players in epic real-time battles across a campaign that will see you conquer the world over the course of weeks. You start in historical World War II conditions, but are free to take the reins of command to rewrite history as you see fit. Use the strengths and weaknesses of different iconic World War II unit types such as tanks, planes, and ships. Choose your own strategy to dominate your enemies. Tank crush your opponents, establish air superiority, or bombard coastal cities. You can also invest in the research tree to use atomic bombs and other superweapons from World War II. Build an empire by conquering provinces, capturing capitals, and taking over entire countries. Establish strategic alliances with other players, and win by waging total war on your neighbors. Click the link in the description below to get a 30-day limited time offer of 13,000 gold and 1 month of High Command subscription for free. See you on the battlefield.